Jesus said, "If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, so that your joy may be complete." Last week at our confirmation service, Bishop Ross talked about belonging, believing and behaving. A circular pattern of our Christian life. You can kind of start anywhere and carry round in the circle, belonging, believing and behaving. We belong to the faith community, we come to believe, and then we behave or act or live in a certain way, he said. Well, that phrase from our gospel reading this morning about keeping the commandments of Jesus is about the way we live, the way we act, the way we love our neighbour, and the way we love our enemy. And Jesus said, in order to do that, we need to abide in love, and then we will discover joy. We had a final session with the confirmation group this last Wednesday, and we talked about what now? Now you've been confirmed, what next? Confirmation's not an end point. Like baptism, it's a beginning point in the faith journey. And we talked about what God might call us to in our lives, what kind of ministries. When we hear the word ministry, we usually think of ordained ministry or something that's going on up the front here in church, priests and deacons or people leading the prayers or maybe people serving at the city mission. But ministry is so much wider than that. We can be disciples and ministers of God in our families, in our workplaces, and in our communities. And in fact, ministry out there in the world is the main ministry. The part in church is just a small piece of that supports that ministry out there. So we talked about how God calls us to be leaders in our workplaces, leading by example, acting with compassion, honesty and care, always looking for the best in others, being the best we can be, being the best at the task set before us. That is one way of being a follower of Jesus. It's one way of fulfilling our calling and our ministry. It's always interesting in different congregations how there are clusters of different occupations. Some years ago, when I was vicar of St Luke's in Wadestown, pretty much everyone was a public servant, which, if you know where Wadestown is in central Wellington, that's probably quite logical. Everyone worked in a government department. In Napier, everyone seemed to be a teacher. I swear we had half of the staff of all the schools in our congregation. Here at St Matthew's, you're more of a mix. But one thing we have noticed over the last couple of years is how many doctors we have in the congregation, and also nurses actually, and other medical trained people, midwives. I tend to joke from time to time that, if you want to have a heart attack, it's a good place. But last year, Kate and I invited our doctors to gather for conversation, and we simply wanted to ask the question, is there anything that you would all like to talk about? Given that you're all doctors and you're all people of faith, is there any way we can support a conversation that might be just for you or that might be for others as well? And we wanted to know how they were going in their working lives as doctors and people of faith. Well, the result of that conversation is the conversation that we're going to have today after church on death and dying and the End of Life Choice Bill, which is before Parliament. Today's conversation is an opening conversation, and if there's interest, we'll carry on with more conversations and maybe bring in experts from other fields and maybe host a public forum for the community. But we just wanted to test the waters first with you today. Like all of us, our doctors have a diversity of opinion on end-of-life options, and they're keen to have a place to explore those views and to listen to each other and to listen to all of you. But for Kate and I, we think it's really important that even before we form an opinion on the end-of-life bill as individuals, it's really important that we take an opportunity to have a conversation about death and dying generally. And of course, end-of-life choices are about that. But it's really important that we are comfortable in talking about death and dying generally. Facing the idea of death for ourselves and for our loved ones is, of course, an incredibly hard thing to do. We don't want to talk about death. It seems a bit morbid. We want to keep to happy topics. And you know, today's readings could have given me lots of happy topics to talk about. It's all about joy and love in the gospel reading. Maybe we should just stick to that. But being able to talk about death, about dying well, and about facing death is actually also part of our Christian life. It's not something that's separate. It's part of the way we live. And even that hard conversation can bring us good things in our lives. There's a prayer at the end of the funeral service which says, "Strengthen faith and hope in us, so that we in turn may not be afraid to die." Comes right at the end of the service after the commendation and committal. And I always think that's such a positive prayer. Strengthen our faith and strengthen hope in us so that we may not be afraid to die. As followers of Jesus, as people of the resurrection, we can face death with hope because Jesus has been there before us. Stephen always says that if you get a bunch of clergy together, you don't have to wait too long before they're telling funeral stories. Every now and then, if we have a dinner party of clergy friends, he says, "I'll count the minutes before we're on to funeral stories." Some funny and maybe some not so funny. So maybe we clergy are used to these conversations, but of course, we all still struggle with these issues in our own families and for ourselves. Even though we get to talk about death professionally, it doesn't mean to say we've got it all sorted out inside. We're no different in that regard. And of course, we each bring attitudes and beliefs about death from our families and from our cultural backgrounds. We'll all have very many different approaches in the way that we think about it. So today, for those of you who are interested, we'll begin a conversation with each other and listen to each other and listen to our fellow parishioners whose calling it is to assist people in health and in illness. And then if people wish, we'll use the skill of others, lawyers and ethicists, nurses, people in the disabled community, friends, as we think about death and dying and the end-of-life bill. And there's also, of course, a wealth of written information. There's a wealth of information on the web which we can share and read together. But in these conversations, and in any life conversations we might have together, we hold on to the thoughts at the heart of today's gospel reading. The Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. It's a beautiful image. God has loved Jesus. Jesus has loved us, so abide in that love. It kind of feels like arms coming around us where we can rest in that love. One writer says that this love is an excellence of character that God has by nature, which we participate in by grace. Such love is primarily interested in the good of the other person rather than one's own. So God has this love by nature. God is this love, and we participate in it by grace. And in this love, we're called to reach out and become community, friends, as Jesus puts it. So as we cycle through the life pattern of belonging, believing, and behaving, and then back again, we give thanks for that grace, that love that we find here, and that we then take into our daily lives, our ministries, our callings. And whether our conversations are about really tough things like death or much happier things, we know that God's intention for us always is to abide in God's love and for our joy to be complete.